Welcome to Health Professional Radio. I'm your host, Neil Howard. Thank you so much for joining us for another segment. In this segment, we're going to be speaking with returning guest Dr. Gregg Sylvester. He's joining us here as Chief Medical Officer at Seqirus, one of the world's largest influenza vaccine providers. He's going to discuss some new real-world evidence that was presented at the Global International Society for Influenza and Other Respiratory Virus Diseases, also known as ISIRV, the World Health Organization virtual conference. It showed that cell-based quadrivalent seasonal influenza vaccines were more effective in children and adults, and adjuvanted trivalent seasonal influenza vaccines were more effective in older populations. Welcome back, Gregg. Thanks for returning.
Well, Neil, thank you for having me. It's a real pleasure to be back.
Well, for those who are not familiar with you as a contributor, give us a bit of your professional background, talk about your role at Seqirus, and then explain what I just said to our audience. All right. Let's see what I can do.
Well, you already introduced me. I'm Gregg Sylvester. I'm a physician by training. I have my boards in pediatrics and preventive medicine, and I've had an absolutely wonderful career, not so much on the clinical side, but really on the public health and preventive medicine side of things. But for the last 5 years, I've had my dream job, and I am the Chief Medical Officer for Seqirus. And as you pointed out, we are one of the largest manufacturers of influenza vaccine. And it's my role to oversee a wonderful group of professionals that dig into this real world evidence and try to scientifically differentiate our vaccines and find out if all that we are saying actually is coming true in the literature. So it's exciting. And what you mentioned here is that we have two unique vaccines for influenza. And the first one is this, you called it cell-based, and that's right. It is not manufactured in egg, it's manufactured in a mammalian cell line. And so why is that a big deal? Well, influenza vaccines have been important and have been around for an awful long time. But we know that when we grow them in egg, sometimes the virus adapts to the egg, and in fact, we call that egg adaptation. And so it no longer looks like the virus that the FDA or the WHO said we ought to be manufacturing. Mm-hmm. So you can have that egg adaptation in the manufacturing process. Thus, when we finish the process, any manufacturer does, it may be slightly different than what is circulating. Mm-hmm. And that's important so that with the cell-based, you actually get away from that. The cell-based actually is an exact copy of what the FDA or the WHO asked us to create, giving us the opportunity to have better protection. And so how do we know that? Well, we go back and we do these retrospective observational studies or real-world evidence, and we look at each influenza season. And this influenza season, the 2019-2020, really before the start of the pandemic, we actually went back and looked at two age groups, those that were under 18 and those that were over 18, the pediatric population and the adult. And both of them showed that they show a better effectiveness than the standard egg vaccine. And that's exciting. Now, one other thing before I get to this other vaccine is that we only looked at 4 years and above because that's how it was licensed in the United States. This Flucelvax is the name of the vaccine. But in fact, now the FDA just approved last month Flucelvax down to 6 months of age. So anybody and everybody in the U.S. can actually get Flucelvax from 6 months all the way up to you're 100 if you choose to. Okay? Now, on the flip side, you talked about an adjuvanted vaccine, and an adjuvant enhances the immune system. And so we've added an adjuvant to one of our flu vaccines. And the idea here is that we give it to those that are 65 plus. And we do that because we know that our immune system wanes over time. There's a medical term for that called immunosenescence. And I'm not sure it starts at 65. Maybe for some of us, it may start at 60 or 50. Maybe others, it might start at 70 or 80. But the fact is, they've all picked 65. And so we've enhanced our vaccine. And it's the same thing. We've looked at this enhanced adjuvanted vaccine influenza vaccine, and we've compared it to a standard egg vaccine. And the same thing, we have seen that it actually does better during this flu season of 2019 to 2020. So those are pretty exciting results in the pediatric population, in the adult population, 18 up to 65, and then we looked at a different vaccine from 65 plus.
Now, are we talking about significant differences in the effectiveness of the different vaccines in these two populations, or are we talking about a combination of the effectiveness and some of the side effects that have always been an issue with flu vaccines, at least in the media?
Yeah, so I think that what we hear in the media, and it's true that many of the influenza vaccines don't perform the same way as some of these other vaccines. And certainly we hear all about the COVID vaccine being so incredibly robust or effective. And what we know that's different about influenza is that the virus constantly drifts. So even if the WHO or the FDA says this is the virus that we want you to make, by the time we're done with the manufacturing process, the virus on its own may have drifted. That may change the effectiveness of our vaccine or the efficacy of our vaccine. The other thing is that although we know viruses don't think, it's a pretty smart virus, and it comes up with ways to avoid our immune system. So there are a whole host of things that we're still learning about influenza. But to your question, typically we see the overall vaccine effectiveness amongst all adults and all hovering between 40 and sometimes as high as 60. And so that's actually a pretty good year if we can go that high. This year, we actually showed that we had a relative vaccine effectiveness of 10% better in those age groups. So that it was significant, statistically significant, that by getting one of these enhanced vaccines, that people did better with medical encounters. So whether they went to their clinic or whether they went to their doctor's office or whether they went to the hospital. So there is some significance in using these, or scientific significance in using these vaccines.
Is there a way, or have we been researching ways to get ahead of the virus and anticipate how it's going to mutate?
Well, I think people have spent their entire careers looking at that, and I don't think we've quite figured that out yet. It's a fascinating virus, and there are many viruses that are very stable. And so, when we learn, mumps, measles, and rubella are all viruses. So we take vaccines for those, but they all oftentimes have lifetime immunity because the virus doesn't seem to be shifting and drifting and changing all the time. But we know that that's not the case with an RNA virus like influenza. What are we learning about RNA viruses right now with COVID? Well, it's mutating. And what it's mutating is it's changing. The RNA viruses don't have that repair mechanism that some of the DNA viruses and what you and I might have in ourselves. And so if it changes, it can't repair itself. Now, the difference between COVID and influenza is that when influenza drifts, the antigen, what our antibodies make against it, actually may not work as well. That's not true with the COVID vaccines thus far. We've seen an alpha, the original COVID, and now we're into Delta, and the vaccine is effective against both. Even though they're mutating, they're probably not changing antigenically, where influenza is known for its antigenic drift. If it shifts and it really changes wholesale, well, then that's a influenza pandemic. So really some fascinating stuff, and you're asking the right question. I just don't think the scientists have figured out how to get ahead of the influenza vaccine, influenza virus.
Well, Gregg, if you would give us a website where we can learn more about the information that was presented at the virtual conference.
Yeah, so if you're looking for that, for the abstracts or for the things that I've just talked about, go to Seqirus, SEQIRUS.US. And that will give you the information that I just spoke about. Mm-hmm. And the other piece that I would just say is that if you're looking for good information on influenza, then I would highly recommend going to cdc.gov, and they really have some wonderful information on that. And I know you didn't ask, but I still want to say we're right in the middle of our flu campaign. And when I mean our nation's flu campaign. The CDC recommends everyone 6 months and older that doesn't have a contraindication to getting an influenza vaccine on an annual basis. I got mine, I think, a week or two ago, but if you haven't gotten your vaccine, I would highly recommend to all of your listeners, this is the prime time to go get it. And we don't know if we'll have a heavy flu season, a medium one, or a light. But what we know is that influenza vaccine is the best protection against influenza.
Gregg, always a pleasure. I'm looking forward to our next conversation.
Well, thank you, Neil. I'm looking forward to the next time we can chat also.
You've been listening to Health Professional Radio. I'm your host, Neil Howard, in conversation with returning guest Dr. Gregg Sylvester. Audio copies of this program are available at hpr.fm and healthprofessionalradio.com.au. You can also subscribe to the podcast on iTunes, listen in, download at SoundCloud, and be sure and subscribe to our YouTube channel at youtube.com, Health Professional Radio.